In 1988, a single comment from George Michael about Whitney Houston's voice created one of the music industry's coldest feuds. For over a decade, two of the world's biggest superstars couldn't stand to be in the same room. But what happened at Clive Davis's birthday party in 1999 changed everything forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if you're ready for one of the most heartwarming redemption stories in music history. It was March 1988, and George Michael was at the height of his fame. Faith had just become a global phenomenon, and he was feeling invincible during a backstage interview at the Brit Awards. When a journalist asked him about the current state of American R&B, George made a comment that would haunt him for years. "Whitney Houston's voice leaves me cold," he said with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never experienced real consequences for his words. "It's technically perfect, but there's no soul there. It's all manufactured emotion." The journalist's eyes lit up. This was exactly the kind of controversial quote that sold magazines. "Are you saying she's not a real artist?" the interviewer pressed. George shrugged, seemingly unbothered by the implications of what he was saying. "I'm saying that when I hear her sing, I don't feel anything. It's like listening to a very expensive karaoke machine." Those words were printed in every major music publication within a week. The headline in Rolling Stone read, "George Michael, Whitney Houston has no soul." What George didn't know was that Whitney Houston was going through one of the most vulnerable periods of her career. The pressure of being called America's sweetheart was suffocating her, and she was constantly battling critics who claimed she wasn't black enough for R&B or real enough for pop. When Whitney's publicist showed her the interview, she was sitting in her dressing room at Madison Square Garden, preparing for what would become one of her most legendary performances. Whitney read the quotes twice, her hands trembling slightly. Her longtime friend and backup singer, B.B. Winans, was in the room and watched her face change from hurt to something much harder. "Whitney," B.B. said gently, "you okay?" Whitney folded the magazine and set it down with deliberate calm. "He thinks I'm a karaoke machine," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "He thinks I have no soul." That night, Whitney Houston delivered a performance of Greatest Love of All that left 20,000 people in tears. She sang with a raw, emotional intensity that seemed to reach into every person's heart and squeeze. When she hit the final note, the silence lasted for 10 seconds before the arena erupted. But the damage between Whitney and George was done. What should have been a simple disagreement between artists became a decade-long Cold War that affected every corner of the music industry. At industry events, they would literally avoid being in the same room. When both were invited to the Grammy Awards in 1990, Whitney's team made sure she arrived after George had already been seated, and they positioned her on the opposite side of the venue. During the 1991 American Music Awards, they were both scheduled to present awards. But when Whitney's team learned George would be there, they insisted the show restructure the entire ceremony to ensure they wouldn't have to interact. The feud became so well known that other artists started taking sides. Elton John, who was close friends with George, publicly supported him during a 1989 interview with The Times. "George is a brilliant artist with impeccable taste," Elton said. "If he says something about another musician, it's worth listening to." Meanwhile, Aretha Franklin, who had mentored Whitney and watched her rise from a young gospel singer to a global superstar, made her position clear during a 1992 interview on The Oprah Winfrey Show. "That young man doesn't understand what he's talking about," Aretha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been the Queen of Soul for 3 decades. "Whitney Houston has more soul in her little finger than most people have in their entire bodies. I've heard her sing in church since she was 16 years old, and I'm telling you, that child has a direct line to the divine." The industry split was so pronounced that record executives started having to carefully plan events to ensure both artists could attend without incident. MTV's Video Music Awards coordinator, Sarah Mitchell, later revealed that planning the seating chart for awards shows became a diplomatic nightmare. "We had to treat it like international relations," Mitchell explained. "Whitney's camp would send us lists of where George would be sitting, and vice versa. It got so complicated that we eventually just started scheduling their appearances for different shows entirely." The tension reached its absolute peak during the 1994 World Music Awards in Monte Carlo. Both artists were staying at the Hotel Hermitage, and despite their team's best efforts to coordinate schedules, they accidentally ended up on the same elevator on the night of the ceremony. Whitney was heading up to the penthouse level for a pre-show interview with French television. George was coming down from his suite, dressed in his signature black leather jacket and dark sunglasses. When the elevator doors opened and they saw each other, the air seemed to freeze. The ride lasted 45 seconds. Neither of them spoke a single word. Whitney stared straight ahead at the numbers above the doors, her hands clasped tightly around her beaded clutch purse. George studied his shoes with the intensity of someone trying to solve a mathematical equation. The only sound was the soft jazz music playing through the elevator speakers. When the elevator reached Whitney's floor, she stepped out without acknowledgement. But just as the doors were closing, George caught a glimpse of her reflection in the mirror, and for a split second, he saw something that surprised him. Not anger, but exhaustion. She looked tired of carrying the weight of their conflict. George later told friends it was the most uncomfortable minute of his life. I realized in that moment that this wasn't just about a careless comment anymore, he admitted during a 1997 interview with Q magazine. It had become this massive thing that was affecting both of our careers, both of our lives. And for what? Because I was young and stupid and said something I shouldn't have said? The elevator incident became legendary in music industry circles, passed down like folklore among publicists and managers as an example of how celebrity feuds could spiral out of control. But it also planted a seed in George's mind. He began to understand that his words from 1988 had had consequences he never intended. As the years passed, both artists began to mature in ways that only time and experience can bring. George started to understand the weight of his words, especially as he faced his own struggles with public scrutiny and personal challenges. His battles with depression, his struggles with his sexuality in an often unforgiving industry, and his growing awareness of how media criticism could affect an artist's mental health all contributed to a new perspective on what he had done to Whitney. Whitney, meanwhile, had proven herself over and over, becoming one of the best-selling artists of all time. But neither seemed willing to make the first move toward reconciliation. Then came December 18, 1999. Clive Davis, the legendary record executive who had guided both artists' careers, was celebrating his 67th birthday at the Rainbow Room in New York City. It was one of the most exclusive parties of the year, with everyone from Alicia Keys to Tony Bennett in attendance. George Michael had flown in from London specifically for the event. He was mingling near the bar when he saw Whitney Houston enter the room. She was wearing an elegant black dress and looked absolutely radiant, but George noticed something different about her demeanor. There was a new confidence, a settled quality that hadn't been there in the 1980s. For a moment, their eyes met across the crowded room. George felt his stomach drop. He had spent years avoiding this exact moment, and now here it was, unavoidable. Whitney began making her way through the party, greeting friends and industry colleagues. George watched nervously as she moved closer and closer to his corner of the room. He considered leaving, but that would have been too obvious. Then she was standing right in front of him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "George," she said simply, offering him one of the glasses. He took it with trembling hands. "Whitney, hi." She smiled, and it was the warm, genuine smile that had made America fall in love with her 15 years earlier. "I have something to say to you," Whitney said, and George braced himself for the confrontation he'd been dreading for over a decade. Instead, Whitney looked him directly in the eyes and spoke 5 words that changed everything. "You were right about me." George's confusion must have been written all over his face because Whitney continued, her voice gentle but clear. "Back then, I was a karaoke machine. I was singing other people's arrangements of other people's songs with other people's emotions. I was afraid to let anyone see who I really was underneath all that perfection." George started to protest, but Whitney held up her hand. "Let me finish," she said. "What you said hurt me. It hurt me for years. But it also made me look in the mirror and ask myself some hard questions. Am I really connecting with these songs? Am I telling my truth, or just hitting the right notes?" She took a sip of her champagne and smiled again. "So thank you, George. You helped me find my soul." George Michael later said that moment was like being hit by lightning. Here was this woman he had publicly criticized, thanking him for helping her become a better artist. Whitney, he started but found himself unable to speak. I know you didn't mean to be cruel, Whitney said. You were just being honest about what you heard. And honestly, I needed to hear it. They talked for over an hour that night, sharing stories about the pressures of fame, the loneliness of being constantly judged, and the struggle to stay authentic in an industry that rewards perfection over truth. When Clive Davis approached them near the end of the evening, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Are you two actually having a conversation? He asked, grinning. We're having a revelation, Whitney replied. 3 months later, Clive called both artists with an idea. He was working on Whitney's greatest hits album and had a song that he thought would be perfect for a duet. The song was called If I Told You That, and it had originally been written for Whitney and Michael Jackson. But when Michael passed on the project, Clive had a different idea. What about George? He suggested to Whitney during a phone call. Whitney was quiet for a long moment. You know what, Clive? I think that might be exactly right. The recording session for If I Told You That took place at Abbey Road Studios in London. Whitney flew in specifically for the project, and when she walked into the studio, George was already there, warming up his voice. You ready to make some magic? Whitney asked, and George smiled. I've been ready for 11 years, he replied. The song was about two people confessing their feelings to each other, and the parallel to their real-life reconciliation was impossible to ignore. As they began the first take, something magical happened in that legendary studio where the Beatles had recorded so many of their masterpieces. Whitney started with the opening verse, her voice filling the room with that distinctive warmth that had made her famous. But this time, there was something different. Gone was the technical perfection that George had once criticized. Instead, her voice carried the weight of experience, of pain transformed into wisdom. When George joined in for his verse, his voice trembled slightly. He was singing directly to Whitney, and everyone in the studio could feel it. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by something much more vulnerable. He was singing an apology, a confession, and a thank you all at the same time. But it was during the bridge that the real magic happened. The two voices came together in a harmony that seemed to resonate not just in their vocal cords, but in their souls. Whitney's powerful, soaring vocals provided the emotional foundation, while George's more intimate, conversational style added layers of vulnerability and honesty. Producer Rodney Jerkins, who had worked with both artists separately, later said he had never heard anything like it. It was like watching two people heal each other in real time, he remembered. They weren't just singing a song, they were having a conversation that had been 11 years in the making. During the second take of the bridge, something unexpected happened. Whitney began improvising, adding runs and flourishes that weren't in the original arrangement. Normally, this might have thrown off another singer, but George instinctively followed her lead, adapting his melody to complement her spontaneous creativity. That's when I knew we had something special, George later recalled. Whitney was showing me what it meant to truly connect with a song, to let it live and breathe instead of just performing it. As they moved into the final chorus, both singers were completely lost in the music. Whitney closed her eyes and let her voice soar, while George harmonized with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of everyone watching. But it was during one particularly emotional section, where the lyrics spoke about trust and second chances, that Whitney had to stop recording because she was crying. I'm sorry, she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue someone quickly handed her. This just means so much to me. I never thought we'd be here, making music together. George walked over from his side of the vocal booth and put his hand on her shoulder. The gesture was captured by the documentary cameras that were recording the session, and it would later become one of the most touching moments in music history. It means everything to me too, George said, his own voice thick with emotion. You've given me a gift I didn't know I needed. They took a 15-minute break, during which they sat in the studio lounge and talked about everything. Their fears, their insecurities, their hopes for the future. The cameras weren't rolling, but sound engineer Alan Douglas, who had worked with everyone from Jimi Hendrix to Paul McCartney, said it was the most honest conversation between artists he had ever witnessed. When they returned to record the final takes, something had shifted. The song wasn't just a duet anymore. It was a musical representation of forgiveness, growth, and the power of human connection. The song was released in May 2000 and became a massive hit across Europe. More importantly, it marked the beginning of a genuine friendship between two artists who had learned that sometimes the most powerful connections come from the most unlikely places. Years later, when George Michael was asked about his relationship with Whitney, he always returned to that night at the Rainbow Room. "She taught me that grace isn't about never making mistakes," he said. "It's about how you handle those mistakes and what you do with the lessons they teach you." Whitney Houston and George Michael proved that even the deepest wounds in the music industry could heal when people were willing to be vulnerable with each other. Their feud became friendship, their conflict became collaboration, and their story became one of the most beautiful examples of redemption in music history. Sometimes it takes a decade to find the right words. Sometimes the best apologies come not in words but in harmony. And sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who help us grow into who we're meant to be. Their duet, If I Told You That, wasn't just a song, it was a musical representation of forgiveness, growth, and the power of second chances. What do you think about Whitney and George's incredible journey from bitter enemies to close friends? Have you ever had someone criticize you in a way that ultimately made you stronger and helped you grow? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories about music's greatest legends and the moments that defined their careers.